Is there an American mind, a way of thinking that is distinctly American? And if so, how does that influence the art and literature coming out of our nation? Well, to begin with, there was no cohesive American mind, and there were a couple reasons for this. First, the colonists thought of themselves as Englishmen and would have resisted any idea of a unique American identity. The same is true of the French in Louisiana, who thought of themselves as Frenchmen, the Spanish in Florida, who saw themselves as Spanish, or the Dutch in New Amsterdam, who saw themselves as Dutch. And we know this because of how they spoke about themselves in the letters and the documents. The connection to the mother country was an important source of protection, but also of cultural pride. And that's important to understand because from the beginning, the people of the New World were very keen um, to show that they had continuity with their mother country and with Europe in general, that they fell under the shadow of Europe and they wanted to show that their manners, their tastes, and their ideas were just as sophisticated. And that's why the music, art, philosophy, and literature and architecture of the colonial period, and even afterwards, it drew heavily on the European models, manners, and tastes. Now, the second reason that there was not what we would call an American identity or mind is because the colonists did not share a common ideology or worldview or framework. Um, they weren't even united around the idea of liberty because the colonies were not started as a haven of liberty per se, but for specific groups to have the liberty to follow their own version of the good life. And that differed from colony to colony. So there was a huge difference between the Puritan version of society at the Plymouth Bay colony versus Catholic Maryland or the mercantile Jamestown, founded on more secular principles. Um, and these different visions were localized to the different colonies and sometimes even led to conflict and tension between the colonies. Now, even these regional identities, however, that were local to the colonies, they never they never approximated a specific American identity, let alone a Pan-American mind, because the vision that the different colonists had, as I said before, they saw it as a continuation of of the European legacy. Even the Puritans at Plymouth Bay, who self-consciously had an idea of starting over and forming a kind of new Israel, entering a kind of promised land, still very much saw themselves as Englishmen, and a continuation of their traditions in England. So there was, for a long time, there wasn't a distinct identity that colonists had as Americans. The first rumblings of what would later develop into a separate American identity, although it wouldn't have been called that at the time, can be detected in the 1760s following the French and Indian War, with emerging ideas of liberty. But even here, it's easy to exaggerate because initially the early ideas of liberty and resistance to alleged tyranny, were very much in the context of the colonists being Englishmen, who felt that their rights of Englishmen were being undermined. Um, but as I said, after the French and Indian War in the 1760s, it does begin to slowly emerge what, in retrospect, we might call an American mind, centered on ideas of liberty and republicanism. Now, the term in retrospect is important here because we have to remember that we're looking back on history from the perspective of later developments. And if Britain had won the war, then subsequent history would see more continuity with the loyalists and the pro-monarchy strain of thought, which even in the 1760s was arguably more significant than the Republican mindset. Revolutionaries always get more traction in the public discourse and in terms of veering history in one particular direction and instigating change, because revolutionaries are louder, more assertive. After all, the types of people who want to keep the status quo tend to have less energy than revolutionaries, and like typically nobody goes and burns down buildings in the name of moderation. Nobody goes and starts riots to preserve the status quo. So it's easy to look back and see the growing the vocal strain in the public discourse of the revolutionaries and think that it was greater than it was at the time. Now, public opinion did start to shift during the war, to be sure, but I don't want to exaggerate the growing Republican mood in the 1760s. But nevertheless, there does start to be this this shift towards Republican ideas of liberty. Now, republicanism in the 18th century sense doesn't have anything to do with the Republican Party that exists today in our political system. It refers to a cluster of ideas that included notions of self-government and popular sovereignty, notions of equality, a new popularization of ideas about liberty from the Enlightenment, including natural rights. And these were all swirling in the intellectual milieu at the time. And this network of ideas is often referred to as republicanism. Now, many of these ideas have been around for at least 100 years or more, actually, but they didn't have significant cachet in the colonies, partly because many of these ideas tended to be eschewed by conservative and Christian thinkers who associated them and even associated the word republicanism with the atheistic or at least anti-Christian currents in France. So it was a lot of these ideas were seen as associated with the anti-religious Enlightenment mood of France. But as Mark Noll pointed out in his book America's God, that association of republicanism with anti-Christian French modern ideas that began to shift after the French and Indian Wars, especially into the 1770s. And a key idea in this shifting ideological ecosystem was the rejection of hereditary power. Now, as modern Americans, we like the idea of nobility, and it brings to mind a certain nostalgia for things that are English, like tea parties. Americans love the idea of nobility and tea parties, and makes us think of Downton Abbey and everything that represents. And this is certainly the case with me because I used to live in England and I was a royalist. So I worked for a paper that defended the monarchy and defended hereditary power and defended the House of Lords. But for our purposes, we need to try to understand things from an 18th century perspective and why the colonists would start to see hereditary power as oppressive. Now, some of it had to do with the economic and political shifts following the French and Indian War. I'm not going to go into all of that because that's not the purpose of our lecture. But um, but they began to see hereditary power as oppressive, and we can understand a little bit why this was, because I was just listening to a lecture from the historian Gordon Wood, and he said that in England in the mid 18th century, all the land was owned by about 400 noble families, and everyone else worked the land as tenants. And this wasn't always the case. There used to be um, independent farmers, freeholders, but they had been gradually gobbled up, so that all of the land was owned by about 400 or so noble families. And so that helps us to understand why there might have been this antagonism to hereditary power, and why thinkers like Jefferson would see independent farmers as the backbone of a free people. And there's more we could say about that, but the point is that rejection of hereditary power was it was just a flashpoint of a much larger Republican impulse that included some of these bullet points that I put here, and what we might call the democratization of all of life. Now, of course, intellectual historians will hate me lumping all of these things together, and with good reason, because there was a vast chasm between the ideas of someone like Thomas Paine on the one hand and John Witherspoon, Patrick Henry, or John Jay on the other. And no one from the colonial period could even, or let's say there was not a common consensus in the colonial period on the precise definition of republicanism. But what I'm really describing here is not so much as specific philosophies or doctrines as an emerging intellectual ecosystem. And in time, many aspects of this ecosystem would later become separated out and develop into distinct and even competing schools of thought. However, in the emerging intellectual atmosphere following the French and Indian War, people began to talk self-consciously about republicanism. And all of these ideas I'm describing were in some sense part of that wider ecosystem. And whether you call it republicanism or populism or egalitarianism or the anti-authority impulse, the democratizing impulse, whatever you call it, these terms are all ways of getting at the same dynamic that was becoming a fixture of the thought world at the time. And in this amorphous cluster of ideas, one common theme that was emerging was, as I mentioned, the rejection of hierarchy. And that came with a new valuation given to the individual through the democratization of all of life. And again, when I use terms like this, I'm talking more from the perspective of social history than intellectual history, though of course the two cannot be fully separated. But clearly, from the perspective of social history, there is an emerging aspect of the cultural personality in which the common man becomes invested with a new type of primacy. And we can see this in everything from Thomas Paine appealing to the common sense of the masses with his tracts, appealing to the masses over educated people. In fact, his most popular book was called Common Sense. Or President Jefferson choosing to consciously dress down to identify with the common man. Or the Constitution banning aristocratic titles, or even things like the anti-clerical mood of the Second Great Awakening. None of these things would have been conceivable in the 17th century colonies, or even in most of Europe at the time, with some important exceptions. But in America, the democratizing impulse ran deep, and it was becoming a feature of the American psyche. So that by the 1830s, the French observer Alexis de Tocqueville, he was amazed to see democratization having touched nearly all aspects of life. At least that was That was his impression as he traveled around and wrote his travel memoirs that became the famous book Democracy in America. Now, my particular interest when it comes to American history is literature and religion. And so I read with interest Nathan Hatch's classic work, The Democratization of American Christianity, where he describes how republicanism and the democratizing impulse, how affected religion in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Now, in laying the groundwork for discussing religious developments, particularly those associated with the 19th century revivals of the Second Great Awakening, Hatch shares how following independence from Britain, the assertion of the individual against authority and hierarchical structures found expression in widespread skepticism against all forms of inherited knowledge. Though naturally the extent of this varied region to region and rich to poor and urban and rural populations. But nevertheless, even with that caveat, he explains how from the revolution onward, Republican equality became the rallying cry for people who challenged every kind of political authority. And as early as the 1790s, this included the authority of lawyers and doctors. They were both being challenged. And he says how there was a push for democratic, personalized, and simplified law, and the populist concept of medicine. We don't need the doctors. There's a kind of do-it-yourself idea of medicine as there is with law and religion. And he tells the story of Samuel Thompson, who was a practitioner of natural remedies. He urged Americans to throw off the oppressive yoke of physicians. And he did that in the same breath as condemning clergymen and lawyers. Americans argued, he said, quote, should in medicine, as in religion and politics, act for themselves. He significantly appealed to private judgment and saying, quote, people are certainly capable of judging for themselves, end quote. So I hope you're getting the sense of this mood that develops as the Republican democratizing impulse begins to spreading through all aspects of life. And this really begins to characterize what we can call the American mind, which becomes significant later on in American literature. We get a sense of how strong this ideological ecosystem is, this democratization of all of life. We get a sense of how powerful it was by attending to some of the things that the critics at the time said. So in 1794, for example, an evangelical Episcopal said, there is more leveling than ought to be consistent with good government. I have as little notion of oppression and tyranny as any man, but a due subordination is essentially requisite in every government. At present, there is too little regard and reverence paid to magistrates and persons in public office, and whence do this disregard and irreverence originate, but from the notion and practice of leveling. So he is talking specifically in relation to the sphere of government and politics, but he is saying that the disorders that he's seeing within that realm are symptomatic of this broader practice of leveling, this idea of leveling out authority and making everyone equal. The same thing that was going on in law, medicine, religion, and so forth. So this leveling mood, this assertion of the primacy of the individual against external structures, this eventually forms part of what I'm calling the American mind, that we start to detect in literature. Now, initially, the colonies and then the United States, they didn't have a distinct tradition in literature because, as I mentioned earlier, they shared a common culture with Europe. The bestsellers in America in the early 19th century were writers like Sir Walter Scott and his Waverley novels. His Waverley novels were huge bestsellers, while the periodicals that came from Europe, such as the Edinburgh and the Quarterly, they were widely read in the States, while the American equivalents were not enjoyed in England. The first American celebrity writer, the novelist Washington Irving, imitated European styles. He spent much time in Europe. He even served as the American ambassador to Spain. And his most famous story, Rip Van Winkle, is based on a German tale. And when he writes about American life, there's often a satirical tone. And because of all this, a lot of people have seen him as not authentically American. And in 20th century histories of American literature, um, written in the 20th century, he tended to be marginalized because he was seen as too European and not authentically American. But another way to look at it would be to say that Irving's very Europeanness reflected his Americanness, because even in the early 19th century, American literature had still not developed a distinct identity. He reflects the America at the time. America was still finding its legs as a separate cultural identity. And Irving reminds us how much Americans were indebted to European conventions and to European culture. And it's telling that this didn't bother Americans at the time. They loved him. He was wildly popular. Cigars were named after him, steamboats, towns. Even like when he died, whole sections of New York City shut down. And it was only because authors came after him, which formed a distinct American identity, that people can then look back on Washington Irving and judge him as being insufficiently American. And when authors do begin to experiment with a distinct American identity, it's rooted in the democratizing impulse that I mentioned earlier, the ecosystem of Republican ideologies, including the primacy of the individual against authority and inherited wisdom. The novels of James Fenimore Cooper, for example, celebrate rugged individualism and the character of Natty Bumppo, who is a distinctly American type of hero. He's also known as Hawkeye and was portrayed by Daniel Day-Lewis in the 1992 film The Last of the Mohicans. He's a frontiersman with the virtues of wildness and self-reliance. And these virtues of wildness and self-reliance are held up over and against the inauthenticity of civilization and political authority. James Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales from 1823 to 1841, and particularly The Last of the Mohicans, 1826, these celebrated self-reliance, and they have a critique of civilized authority. And we can see the democratizing impulse at work here. We can see Cooper exploring distinctively American themes like the wilderness, the frontier, the plight of Indians, and so forth. So what we might call an American mind begins to develop in literature, as it already had more broadly in thought, ideology, and some of the cultural dynamics that we explored earlier. But it was certainly Ralph Waldo Emerson who became the quintessential prophet of the American mind. Arnold Weinstein, who's at Brown University, said that it was only in Emerson that American literature first became American. And there's a lot of truth to that. There's truth to that partly because Emerson himself saw his mission to forge a type of literature and thought that was distinctly American, unshackled from past tradition and history. And we see this in his essay Nature, and even more so in his famous 1837 Harvard address, The American Scholar, where he sounds the charge for a new generation to develop a type of scholarship and literature that is distinctly American, unshackled from dependence on the products of other lands. But the main reason that I say that Emerson is the quintessential prophet of the American mind is that his thought is so thoroughly rooted in the earlier ideas I mentioned. Think back to the democratizing values that were emerging, the skepticism of inherited wisdom, a simplified, pragmatic approach to law and medicine, a new populism that was skeptical of authority, and a priority of common sense against the experts, the individual against the world. These I had described all this ecosystem of ideas as a distinctive feature of the American mind, and in many ways, these coalesce in Emerson's thought. He combines the self-reliance of the frontiersman with the democratizing impulse, while also offering a distinctly American answer to the Romantic movement. He started out as a Unitarian clergyman, but resigned after a crisis of conscience brought about by not believing in the Lord's Supper. And he went on to found an intellectual movement called Transcendentalism, and it included other literary figures of the 1820s and 30s in New England, including Henry David Thoreau, Amos Alcott, Margaret Fuller, and many others. And they were self-consciously developing an American school of thought and literature. Emerson believed strongly that the movement was defined by an emphasis on the common man. In his Harvard address, he suggested that the rich sources for literature are not what we find in other lands, but the common things of American life. The literature of the poor, the feelings of the child, the philosophy of the street, the meaning of household life are the topics of the time. It is a great stride, it is a sign, is it not, of new vigor, when the extremities are made active, when currents of warm life run into the hands and the feet. I ask not for the great, the remote, the romantic, what is doing in Italy or Arabia, but as Greek art or provincial minstrelsy. I embrace the common, I explore and sit at the feet of the familiar and the low. Give me insight into today, and you may have the antique and future worlds. Keep the antique and future worlds for yourself, but give me insight into the common things of today, the authentic, real American experience of common people. Emerson became wildly popular through his essays and lectures, essays that were usually first lectures. In the 1830s and 40s, you have to remember this was a time before television, before YouTube, before mass entertainment. So in the evenings, people loved to attend lectures, and they loved to talk in their communities about the things they heard in the lectures. And so Emerson's popularity as a lecturer was due to his incredible eloquence, but not eloquence in terms of high academic erudition, but in eloquence in the sense that he could put the experience of common men and women into moving metaphors and description, using language that stuck with him and resonated with their experience. And although he was the leader of an intellectual movement called Transcendentalism, his actual ideas were not very transcendental as we would use the term today, because he reflected a kind of down-to-earth pragmatism, even sometimes to the point of anti-intellectualism. He is the intellectual equivalent of the frontiersman or cowboy mythos, the self-made man who builds his philosophy up not based on external structures, whether inherited wisdom or even deference to reason, but based on self-authenticity and the immediacy of the self and its instincts. And this emphasis on the primacy of inner feelings and the individual, it reminds us that he was working during the broader Romantic movement. He was a contemporary of people like Wordsworth in England. Um, but he offered a specifically American version of the Romantic movement that includes a kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps moralism, and the idea of the intellectual self-made man. We see some of these themes emerge in one of his most famous essays, Self-Reliance. And this was based on a series of lectures he delivered in the 1830s. Just as he encouraged American scholars not to rely on foreign models, he also encouraged people not to depend on anything in society that might stifle the authenticity of the individual self. For example, in Self-Reliance, he cautioned against looking to history for precedent and guidance. He writes that history is an impertinence and an injury if it be anything more than a cheerful epilogue or parable of my being and becoming. So history is useful if it helps me understand my own being and becoming, my own self-reliance, but not if we look to it for any sort of guidance or precedent. And so you can see here the broader democratizing impulse, the rejection of authority, of anything that might stifle the primacy of the individual. Now, remember I said that earlier that in the 1760s and 70s, the ideological ecosystem of republicanism, of this tendency towards the democratizing of everything, it included a cluster of different impulses and ideologies that would later crystallize and even develop, in some cases, into competing strains of thought. And this is one example. The founding fathers, despite their rejection of hereditary power, were elitist insofar as they tended to think that gentlemen of leisure, education, and merit had responsibility to govern civic affairs, on behalf of those who worked with their hands. So they accepted a hierarchical view of society, even while rejecting monarchy and inherited privilege. But the founding fathers, part of their emphasis on a gentleman being defined by good manners, taste, merit, and so forth, that included a huge deference for history and for the wider Enlightenment culture from which the inherited ideas about manners, good taste, and so forth, and rulers and gentlemen needed to be aware of history and the wider intellectual currents. Very much, this was very much a kind of Enlightenment, 18th century type of notion of the ruling class as people who were true gentlemen, not through inherited means, but through superior intellect and manners and taste and education. So, but included in that was this emphasis on inherited forms of wisdom. But Emerson takes the American democratizing impulse much further. He rejects, at least in principle, though probably not in practice. He was a very he was not a kind of a cowboy out west forging his own way. He was a very cosmopolitan, ordinary type of New Englander. But in his philosophy, he rejects inherited forms of wisdom, including social, religious, ecclesiastical, and intellectual authorities. And he argues that these need to give way to the consuming obligation of the self-reliant individual. And we see this again in his essay Self-Reliance, where he contrasts tuition with intuition. The former being everything you learn from others, but the latter, the intuition, being what you tap into from your aboriginal self. And echoing Rousseau, but giving it a distinctly American flavor, this is a philosophy of the natural, the instinctive, the authentic, over the artificial forms that we inherit from culture. And Emerson takes this in a different direction than some Rousseau and some of the other people in the Romantic movement. He was very radical, even questioning external codes of morals and ethics. So he argues that the final barometer for even what's right or wrong must be the lone individual and not external standards of ethical behavior. He writes again in Self-Reliance, "No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names, very readily transferable to that or this. The only right is what is after my constitution, the only wrong what is against it." And so this individualizes the notion of popular sovereignty. It's not just a people who are sovereign against the monarch or instead of the monarch, but the individual is sovereign against all else. And we don't want to over exaggerate the implication of Emerson's polemics, because in practice he was a strong proponent of morality. But his point is that morality is accessed through individual conscience. Accordingly, he celebrated children who live without concerning themselves for moral issues, with moral issues. This theme of self-reliance against the norms imposed on us from history, culture, tuition, morality, etc., offers a kind of anti-society mood that was characteristic of the Romantic movement of the time. Remember that Emerson was a contemporary of the poet William Wordsworth in England, and he was also a contemporary of the older Coleridge, who championed an individualism that questioned societal norms. But Emerson brings a distinctly American flavor to this larger intellectual milieu. Wordsworth, for example, had a deep reverence for friendship and community, whereas Emerson's individualism would be suspicious of friendship and community. In Emerson's lecture and essay, Friendship, he writes that all association must be a compromise. And what is worse, the very flower and aroma of the flower of each of the beautiful natures disappears as they approach each other. So our social bonds force us to be inauthentic. Even reaching out to others through philanthropy was problematic for Emerson. He viewed his views on individualistic self-reliance led him to despise the ideas of charity that would see us in some sense responsible for each other. Writes, "Then again, do not tell me as a good man did today of my obligation to put all poor men in good situations. Are they my poor? I tell thee, thou foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent I give to such men as do not belong to me and to whom I do not belong. There is a class of persons to whom by all spiritual affinity I am bought and sold. For them I will go to prison if I need be. But your miscellaneous popular charities, the education at the College of Fools, the building of meeting houses to the vain end of which many now stand, almost to slots, and the thousandfold relief societies, though I confess with shame I sometimes succumb and give the dollar. It is a wicked dollar by which by and by I shall have the manhood to withhold." So he aspires to reach a point where he is no longer giving to charity. Now, in later life, Emerson softened and became involved in social causes. But even in his earlier writings, there was a kind of moralizing and a real concern to embed his American style of individualistic moralism into society. He's wanting to make a better world. So he's not perhaps as selfish and as he comes across, completely unconcerned for the poor and for society. And this suggests just how complex of an author he was. His polarity between individualism and and a morality rooted only in the self and do-goodism, between privatizing morals and trying to embed them in society. These polarities are a tension that in a sense, lies at the heart of the American project itself. Look how today, as a nation, we still struggle both at the level of domestic policy as it relates to individuals, but also foreign policy as it relates to nations. We struggle with the strong impulse to preserve autonomy and self-determination with an equally strong notion that this is how things need to be. And this is how things need to be, and we're going to make the world and the individual what in this particular mold. I mean, this is a tension that has run through American society from the beginning, and all these tensions are evident in Emerson, which is why he's in many respects what I call the quintessential prophet of the American mind. He includes the complexities and ambiguities and tensions that are never very far from the American mind. The authors who follow in Emerson's wake develop similar themes. Walt Whitman, he was actually a contemporary of Emerson, he explores the nature of individuality and selfhood in a very raw and visceral way that is characteristic of the American experience. And in the work of Mark Twain, there is a cynicism about old conventions like the chivalry of King Arthur, and even a cynicism about authority in general. For example, in Huckleberry Finn, there's no authority figures that are portrayed positively, and it's the misfits like Huck Finn and the runaway slave Jim. They're the heroes. And this self-reliant, self-made man who doesn't quite fit with the conventions of the world and is skeptical of inherited forms of wisdom and authority. This would pave the way in the American tradition for the classic Hemingway hero. We can trace this thread running through Emerson, the Hemingway hero, right through to the lonely grandeur of the Marlboro Man. And there's a romantic individualism in this vision, but there is also something kind of lonely and non-social about it. Thoreau, of course, went out and lived in the wilderness, and that wasn't Emerson's style, but his vision of self-reliance was deeply non-social. And this non-social aspect comes out in the Western genre. The Western genre, and perhaps especially how this is mediated to us in film, is very important in understanding how the American mind takes shape in the 20th century. America doesn't really have a founding epic like the Greeks had Homer's epics, or the Romans had Virgil. And so in many ways, our founding epic is the classic Western. And the hero of many Westerns is someone like Shane, riding off into the distance, as in this picture here from the movie Shane. He's an individual who, because of his self-reliance, doesn't quite fit in society. And this theme comes out in many Westerns, especially as they're portrayed in film. Now, Americans are deeply communal. Even the settlements out in the West only worked because of people banding together. And so the classic hero of the Western and many other aspects of Westerns sometimes give a wrong idea of what life was actually like in the frontier. It was deeply communal. And yet, I think it's telling that the person we admire in many of these stories is the loner, the maverick character, or someone like Clint Eastwood in The Man with No Name. These types of heroes, they don't reintegrate well. They ride off into the sunset. And regardless of how true this may have actually been to the experience of the West, it it shows it deep taps into something deep within the American mind that I've been trying to share throughout this lecture. The Western embodies ideas like the value of the bold stroke, the virtue of risk taking, of making things up as you go along, of deviating from the rules but still somehow saving the day. Like in football, the coach called such and such, but at the last minute, the quarterback in the huddle he decided to do something else, and then we win. And that's the sort of hero we admire in America. We we also admire stories that embody the quick fix priorities of the gold rush, the idea of going west and becoming rich, of the American dream. Um, this is this is something that deeply resonates with Americans and comes out in our literature. And with these types of um, admiration of quick fix solutions is a kind of impatience with thinking too much, with complicating things. There's a kind of keep it simple, stupid type of mentality, like the hero in Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea. He keeps telling himself to stop thinking. And this kind of echoes the same simplicity that we have in Mark Twain. But the values of the cowboy and the frontier, of simplicity and self-reliance, this also sets up the tensions that are explored in literature. So what happens when the optimism of the American dream turns out to be an illusion? That's something that would be explored by Steinbeck. What happens when the frontier is closed and the pursuit of freedom and prosperity starts to become a zero-sum game? That's something that's explored in The Great Gatsby. What happens when there are obstacles in the pursuit of freedom, when the pursuit of my freedom conflicts with with somebody else's freedom and so forth. So there's these tensions and paradoxes um, that, and I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much richness in American art and literature, because art and literature is the perfect avenue for working out and exploring these types of paradoxes and ambiguities and tensions.